The rain came down on Hollowbrook the way grief comes down on a quiet man, slow at first, then all at once, then refusing to stop. By the third hour of the storm, the gutters on the high street ran black with mud and pine needles, and the lanterns swinging from the eaves of the Crooked Hart Tavern hissed and sputtered as the wind tried, again and again, to tear them down. Inside the tavern, Brennan Marsh was washing the same tankard for the fourth time. He was a tall man, broad at the shoulders and narrow at the hip, with hair that had once been the colour of dark wheat, and was now the colour of wheat that had been left too long in the rain. His hands were big and his fingers were careful, and there was a thin white scar that ran from the knuckle of his thumb to the inside of his wrist, the kind of scar a sword leaves when a man is just barely fast enough. He did not like to look at it. He did not like to be reminded. The tavern was empty. It had been empty since just past the supper hour, when old Tomlin and the miller's son had finished their ale and stumbled out into the wet to find their way home. Brennan had not bothered to lock the door behind them. In a village like Hollowbrook, in a storm like this one, no one came knocking after dark. The roads from the south were washed out. The roads from the north led nowhere worth going. He set the tankard down, dried his hands on the apron tied at his waist, and walked the length of the common room to bank the fire. The hearth was wide and blackened, built of river stones the size of a man's head, and the flames inside it were low and patient. He laid on another log, oak, slow burning, the last of the good wood he had split in autumn, and watched the sparks rise into the chimney like a small red flock taking flight. It was then that he heard the sound. At first he thought it was the wind. The wind in Hollowbrook had 100 voices, and on a night like this it used all of them at once. The whistle through the shutter slats, the moan in the chimney, the low, troubled muttering of the eaves. But this sound did not belong to the wind. It came from beneath it, beneath all of it, low and steady and laid against the heavy oak of the front door. A knock. 3 knocks, in fact. Slow, heavy. The kind of knock that was meant to be unmistakable, but not threatening. The kind of knock a person made when they did not have the strength left to knock harder. Brennan straightened up from the hearth. He did not reach for the cudgel he kept behind the bar. Not yet. But he did not move toward the door, either. He stood very still in the middle of the common room, the firelight at his back, and he listened. The knock came again, 3 times. Slower this time. He crossed the room. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots, and the rushes he had spread that morning crunched dry and brittle under his weight. At the door he paused, his hand on the iron latch, and he listened a 3rd time. There was breathing on the other side. He could hear it through the wood. Not the panting of a man who had run far, but the long, deep, shuddering breath of a creature that was trying very hard not to cry out. He lifted the latch. He pulled the door open against the storm, and what stood on the threshold of the Crooked Hart Tavern, framed by the silver-black rain and the rattling lantern and the wide, dark mouth of the night, was not a man at all. She was tall. That was the first thing he understood, that he was looking up, not down, and Brennan Marsh was not a small man. She stood a full head higher than he did, and her shoulders, beneath the soaked grey wool of her cloak, were wider than the door frame had been built to accommodate. Her skin was the colour of riverstone after rain, a deep, mossy grey-green, and her tusks. The lower 2, curving up past her upper lip, caught the lantern light and threw it back in a dull yellow gleam. An orc, a she-orc, in Hollowbrook, on his doorstep. Brennan had been a soldier once. He had fought orcs in the campaigns east of the Iron Reach, in the long bad year when the southern legions had broken and the northern levies had been called up to fill the gaps. He had killed orcs. He had been wounded by orcs. He knew the look of them, the heavy brow, the broad flat nose, the eyes that always seemed to be measuring you for the grave. But this orc was not measuring him. This orc was holding her belly. She was huge with child. Beneath the cloak, beneath the soaked leather jerkin she wore, the swell of her was so pronounced that for a moment Brennan thought she must be wounded, that she had taken some terrible blow that had swollen her abdomen into that taut, impossible curve. But then she shifted her weight, and he saw the way she moved, and he understood. He had grown up on a farm. He knew what a creature about to give birth looked like. He had just never seen it on a creature that could break his neck with one hand. "I will not hurt you," she said. Her voice was lower than a woman's voice should be, lower than most men's, and it carried the rough, rolling burr of the Orcish tongue beneath her common speech. But the words were clear. The words were careful. The words were the words of someone who had thought very hard about what she was going to say before she said it. "I have no weapons," she went on. "I have no companions. I have walked from the high pass for 3 days, and I cannot walk further. The child is coming. I ask only that you let me lie down by your fire. I will leave before the dawn, if I am able. If I am not able, you may do with me as you please." Brennan did not move. The rain came in past her and wet the rushes at his feet. "You'll be killed if you stay," he said. His voice sounded strange to him, too steady, too quiet. "There are men in this village who lost sons to your kin. They'll come with axes. They won't wait for a hearing." "Yes," she said. "I know. You knew, and you came anyway. I had nowhere else." The wind howled. The lantern swung. Somewhere out in the dark, a shutter banged once, twice, and went still. Brennan looked at her, at the soaked cloak, at the trembling that was beginning to set into her great shoulders, at the way her hand pressed against the underside of her belly, as though she were holding something precious from falling. He thought of the scar on his thumb. He thought of the sword that had made it. He thought of the man who had carried that sword 20 years ago in a different country, and what that man had sworn to himself, bleeding in a ditch, about the kind of life he would live if he lived at all. "Come in," he said. "Come in, before the whole village hears the door." She stepped across the threshold. She had to duck her head to do it. And Brennan Marsh, who had been a tavern-keeper for 11 quiet years, closed the heavy oak door behind her and slid the bar into place and felt, for the first time since he had come to Hollowbrook, that his life had just begun again. He led her to the back room. The back room of the Crooked Hart had been, in the days of the previous owner, a storeroom for barrels and salt pork and the long-handled brooms that no one ever quite knew where to put. Brennan had cleared it out his first winter and made of it something better. A small private chamber with a narrow cot, a basin and pitcher, a single shuttered window, and a hearth of its own that shared a chimney with the great hearth in the common room. He had built it for travellers. In 11 years, he had rented it perhaps a dozen times. Mostly it stood empty, and mostly he was glad it did, because what he had built it for, though he would not have said so aloud, was the possibility of someone arriving who needed to be hidden. He had not, until tonight, known that this was what he had built it for. The Orc Woman sat down on the cot, and the cot creaked beneath her weight, and she let out a long breath that was almost, but not quite, a moan. "What do you need?" Brennan asked. She looked up at him. Her eyes, he saw now in the better light, were not the muddy yellow of the orcs he had fought in the east. They were the colour of old amber, almost gold, and the whites of them were laced with red from exhaustion and from the storm. There was a smear of mud across her cheekbone and a cut, half scabbed, along the line of her jaw. "Water," she said. "Boiled. As much as you can spare. Clean cloth. A knife. Sharp, with a flame put to the blade. Something to bite on. Salt, if you have it. Strong drink, if you do not." He nodded. He turned to go. "Tavernkeeper!" He stopped. "My name is Vraska," she said, "of the Broken Tusk clan. I tell you this, not because it matters to you, but because if I do not survive the night, someone should know who lies dead in your back room." Brennan looked at her for a long moment. The lantern in his hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, he thought, but from something older and more complicated than fear. "My name is Brennan," he said. "Brennan Marsh. And no one is going to die in my back room tonight." He left her there. He went to the kitchen and he stoked the cook fire and he set the great copper kettle on its hook and he filled it from the rain barrel by the kitchen door. He pulled clean linen down from the shelf. The good linen, the linen he had been saving for, he did not know what, and he tore it into strips. He took down the small sharp knife he used for boning fowl and he set it on the hearthstone to heat. He found the salt. He found the brandy. He found a leather strap that had once been the cheek piece of a bridle and now hung beside the back door for no reason he could remember. And as he worked, he listened. He listened to the storm. He listened to the wind that was beginning, at last, to gentle. He listened to the long, slow breaths of the woman in the back room and the way they were beginning, every so often, to break into something tighter and more urgent. And he listened, too, to the village. Hollowbrook slept under its sodden thatch and its shuttered windows. Beyond the tavern, the high street was a black river. Beyond the high street, the houses leaned against one another like old men sharing warmth. And in those houses lay men he had drunk with, men he had broken bread with, men he had stood beside at the autumn fair and the spring planting and the burial of 3 good neighbours over 11 long years. He thought of Halen the blacksmith, whose elder brother had died at the siege of Carrowmore with an Orcish arrow in his throat. He thought of old Marek, who still kept the dented helm of his grandson on the mantel above his fire. He thought of Father Alwyn, the village priest, who preached every 7th day that the Orc kin were the unmade children of the great below, and that no soul lived behind their yellow eyes. He thought of what these men would do if they knew. If a single one of them woke in the night and saw a light in the wrong window. If a single one of them came to the tavern in the morning for bread and saw a footprint too large for a man's foot in the wet earth by the back door. He carried the kettle and the linen and the brandy back to the small room, and he closed the door behind him, and he did not look at the front of the tavern where the bar lay across the great oak door and where the storm was beginning, very slowly, to die. The pains came in waves, and the waves came closer together, and somewhere between the 2nd hour and the 3rd hour of the night, Brennan stopped being a tavernkeeper and began to be something else. He did not have a word for what he was. He was a man kneeling beside a cot. He was a pair of hands that brought water and took away soiled cloth. He was a voice that said, "Breathe, breathe slow. You are doing well into the dim, flickering air." And he did not know where he had learned to say such things, only that he said them and that they seemed, for whatever small thing it was worth, to help. Vraska did not scream. That was the thing he would remember, later, when he tried to put the night together in his mind. She did not scream. She made low sounds, long, growling sounds that came from deep in her chest, like the sound a great cat makes when it is wounded and does not wish to be found. She gripped the wooden frame of the cot, and the frame creaked, and once, in a bad moment near the 4th hour, the side rail split with a dry crack, and she let go of it at once, almost apologetically, and reached instead for the leather strap and bit down on it without a word. "You can cry out," Brennan said. "There is no one to hear but me, and I have heard worse." "My people," she said, around the leather, "do not cry out. Your people are not here." She looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes shining with sweat and with the firelight, and she did not answer. He learned things about her in the slow hours, not because she told him exactly, but because pain loosens the seams of a person and lets the underneath show through. He learned that she had been walking for more than 3 days, that the truth was closer to 5, that she had crossed the high pass on foot when the high pass had still been snowed in places, and that her boots, when he pulled them off her swollen feet to ease her, were worn through at the soles in a way that spoke of months, not days. He learned that there was a brand on the inside of her left forearm, 3 slashes, deep and old, the kind of mark that was not put there by friends. He learned that she flinched when he reached too quickly toward her face, and that she did not flinch at all when he reached toward her belly, as though she had decided long ago which parts of herself she would still allow to be touched. He learned that she was younger than he had thought. Beneath the hard set of her jaw and the long muscle of her shoulders, beneath the brand and the scars and the careful, weighed-out words, she was perhaps not yet 30 winters old. She might have been 25. It was hard to tell, with orcs. He had been told, once, by a man who claimed to know that orcs aged faster than men and died younger. But he had never quite believed it, and looking at her now, he believed it less. "Where is the father?" he asked her, in the long valley between two of the contractions, when her breath had steadied enough that she could speak. "Dead," she said. "In the war? There is no war. There is always a war." She almost smiled at that. It was a terrible smile, half a grimace, but it was a smile. "He was killed by my own people," she said, "because of what we made together, because of the child. They would have killed me too, but I ran. To where? To anywhere. To here. Why here?" She closed her eyes. The next contraction was beginning. He could see it in the tightening of the great muscles along her side. But she answered him anyway, before it took her, in a voice so quiet he had to bend close to hear it over the crackling of the fire. "Because of a story," she said. "A story my grandmother told me when I was small, about a place far to the south in the foothills of the Iron Mountains. A village by a brook. A man who would open his door." She did not say more. The contraction took her, and she bit down on the leather strap, and her whole great body bowed up off the cot like a drawn bow, and Brennan put his hand on her shoulder and held it there and did not let go. But he thought, even then, in the middle of the noise and the heat and the long, terrible work of birth, of his grandmother's mother, who had been, in another country, in another age, a healer of great renown, who had been said, in the family stories, to have walked between the camps of men and orcs alike, who had been said to have laid hands on any creature that bled, regardless of what shape the wound had been made in. He thought of her, and he thought of the story Vraska had been told, and he wondered, for the first time in his life, whether stories could be older than blood, and whether blood could be older than borders, and whether anything in the world was as separate as he had been taught it was. The child came at the grey hour. That is what they call it in the country around Hollowbrook, the grey hour. It is the time before the dawn, when the night has spent itself and the day has not yet arrived, when the sky outside the shutters has begun to lighten, but only barely, only enough to remind a person that there is still a sky. It is the hour when the very old are said to die, and when, sometimes, the very new are said to arrive. The child arrived. Vraska gave one last long sound. Not a scream, even now, but something deeper than a scream. Something that seemed to come from a place inside her that had been waiting all her life to be opened. And then the child was in Brennan's hands, slick and warm and impossibly small, and Brennan was looking down at it and crying, though he did not know that he was crying until he felt the tears on his own jaw. It was a daughter. He tied off the cord with the strip of linen he had set aside for the purpose, and he cut it with a small, sharp knife that had been heating on the hearthstone, and he wiped the child clean with the warm, wet cloth, and he wrapped her in the softest of the linen pieces, the piece he had been saving without knowing why he was saving it. And he did all of this with hands that were shaking, and he did all of this without taking his eyes off the small face, the small, dark, perfect face, for more than a second at a time. She did not cry. That was the second thing he would remember about that night. The child did not cry. She opened her eyes. Eyes that were the deep purple grey of a storm cloud. Eyes that he knew, even as he looked into them, would change in the coming weeks to some other colour. And she looked at him with the long, slow, considering gaze of an old woman taking the measure of a stranger. "Give her to me," Vraska said. Her voice was wrecked. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. Her great shoulders were trembling with the effort of holding herself upright on the cot. But her arms came up, and Brennan laid the child in them, and Vraska bent her head down over the small wrapped bundle, and she made a sound, low in her throat, that was not a word in any language he knew. But he understood it. He understood every part of it. He stood back. He went to the basin and he washed his hands. He went to the hearth and he laid on more wood, because the room had gone cold while neither of them was looking. He filled a cup with brandy and he set it on the small stool beside the cot where Vraska could reach it. And then he stood, for a long moment and looked at the woman and the child by the firelight. It was then that he saw the mark. The linen had fallen open at the child's left shoulder. Only a little, only the smallest slip of cloth, the kind of thing a man might never have noticed if he were not standing exactly where Brennan was standing, with the firelight falling exactly the way the firelight was falling. There was something on the child's shoulder. Brennan blinked. He thought, at first, that it was a smear of blood. He thought, next, that it was a bruise from the birth. He took half a step closer, and Vraska, who had been watching him with those amber eyes the whole time, who had missed nothing, who would not miss anything for the rest of her long, careful life. Vraska did not stop him. He bent down. He moved the linen very gently away from the child's shoulder. The mark was not blood. It was not a bruise. It was a birthmark, small and sharp-edged, no larger than the pad of a man's thumb. It was the color of pale silver grey against the deep mossy green of the child's skin, and it was shaped. There was no mistaking it, no possible mistaking it, no possible way in the world to look at it and call it anything else. It was shaped like a stag's head, antlered in profile, with a single small star above the brow. Brennan Marsh, who had been a tavernkeeper in Hollowbrook for 11 quiet years, who had washed tankards and kept his head down and answered to a name that was not his name, fell to his knees beside the cot. He could not breathe. He put one hand on the floorboards to keep from falling further. He put the other hand, very slowly, to his own throat, to the place beneath his shirt where, on a leather cord, he had worn for 11 years a small silver token he had never shown to any living soul. He drew the cord out. He held the token up. He looked from the mark on the child's shoulder to the token in his hand, and from the token in his hand to the mark on the child's shoulder. They were the same. The stag, the antlers, the single star. "How?" he said. His voice did not sound like his voice. "How is this possible? How?" Vraska, who had been waiting for this moment, who had walked 5 days through the high pass and bitten through a leather strap and torn her hands open on the frame of a tavern cot to bring this moment into being. Vraska looked up from her daughter's face, and her amber eyes met his, and she said, very quietly, "I think you know how. I think you have always known. I think that is why I came." He had to sit down. He sat down on the floor, with his back against the wall and his legs out in front of him like a child's legs, and he held the small silver token in his palm, and he stared at it as though he had never seen it before. The crest of House Aldermere, the stag's head, antlered, the single star above the brow, the mark of a family that had held, until 23 years ago, the wide green valleys of the North March. And that had been broken in a single bloody week by a betrayal from within and a war from without, and a king who had decided, in the end, that it was easier to let an old house die than to spend the soldiers it would have cost to save one. Brennan Marsh was not Brennan Marsh. He had been born Aldrin Cassius Aldermere, third son of Lord Cassian Aldermere, in the great stone keep at Northwatch, on a winter night so cold the wine had frozen in the cups of the men who had ridden through the snow to bring the news of his birth to his father's bannermen. He had been raised to ride and to read, to fight with a sword in his right hand and a dagger in his left, to recite the names of his ancestors back 9 generations to the founding of the house. He had been the youngest. He had been the wild one. He had been 12 years old when the betrayal came. He remembered, even now, the smell of the keep burning. He remembered his mother's hand on the back of his neck, pushing him down behind a low stone wall as the riders came through the gate. He remembered his eldest brother, Garrick, who had been 20 and tall, and laughing only a week before, lying face down in the cobbles of the inner yard with his arms thrown wide as though he had been trying, at the very end, to embrace something. He remembered his sister, Mira's voice, calling for him from the south tower, the voice cutting off mid-word and never starting again. He remembered his father pressing the silver token into his hand. He remembered the words his father had said. Live. Live and be no one. Live and do not come back until you are ready to take what is ours. Live, Aldrin. Live. He remembered running. He remembered 11 years of running, through 3 countries and 4 false names, before he had washed up at Hollowbrook with a different name and a tavern-keeper's apron and a careful, patient, deliberate plan to forget that he had ever been anyone at all. And now there was a child in his back room with the crest of his murdered house burned into her skin like a brand. "Tell me," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Tell me everything." Vraska shifted the sleeping child against her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering what little strength she had left, and then she opened them and she began to speak. "My grandmother was a slave," she said, "in the high country, beyond the Iron Mountains. She was taken in a raid when she was a girl, by a clan that is no longer a clan, and she was bought and sold 3 times before she ended in the household of a man named Dorvath." Brennan did not know the name. He waited. Dorvath was a war chief. He had fought in the great campaigns on the side of the southern kings for coin. He had ridden in his youth with a captain of men from a place he called Northwatch. He had loved that captain, loved him as orcs love, which is fiercely and without explanation. And when that captain was betrayed and his house burned, Dorvath rode back to the North March with 20 of his warriors, and he searched the ruins for 3 days, looking for anyone alive. "He found my grandmother," she said. "She was a slave in the camp of the men who had done the burning. She was 13 years old. She had seen things. She had seen things she would not speak of, ever, even at the end of her life. Dorvath killed the men who had owned her. He took her with him, and when she was old enough to understand, he told her what he had seen at Northwatch, and he gave her something." Vraska reached, with one slow hand, beneath the collar of her own jerkin. She drew out a cord. On the cord hung a token. It was silver. It was the size of a man's thumbnail. It was shaped like a stag's head, antlered, with a single small star above the brow. "He had taken it from the body of his captain's eldest son," she said. "In the courtyard. He had closed the boy's eyes, and he had taken the token, and he had carried it for 40 years before he gave it to my grandmother and told her, 'If ever, in your life or your children's lives or your children's children's lives, you find one of the blood of this house still living, you go to him, you tell him what was done. You ask him for nothing, but you give him this so that he will know.'" She held the token out across the space between them. Brennan took it. His hand was shaking. "And the child?" he said. He could barely speak. "Why does she? How does she?" "My mate," Vraska said quietly, "was Dorvath's grandson. The blood of that house has been carried in my family for 3 generations, tavernkeeper. Sometimes it sleeps. Sometimes, in a child, it wakes. The mark on her shoulder is not the only one. Look at her eyes when they have settled. Look at the line of her brow. She is more yours than mine, in the old way of saying it. She is the last of your house, born to the last of mine." The fire crackled. The first grey light of true dawn was beginning to come in around the edges of the shutters. Brennan looked down at the 2 tokens in his palm. His father's, his brother's, side by side after 23 years apart. And he began, very quietly, to weep. The village began to stir an hour after sunrise. Brennan heard it before he saw it. The cock crowed in the yard of the smithy, 3 doors down. The baker's shutter banged open. A dog barked somewhere along the lane to the mill. The slow, ordinary noises of a small place waking up to a wet morning after a hard storm. He stood in the doorway of the back room and he listened. Vraska had fallen asleep at last. The child curled against her chest, her great shoulders rising and falling in the slow rhythm of someone who had not truly slept in many days and was at last permitting herself to. He had cleaned the room as best he could. He had carried the soiled linen out to the kitchen yard and buried it in the ash pit. He had washed the blood from the floorboards. He had set the kettle on for tea, and he had made himself, with hands that still trembled, a single slice of bread and butter that he could not bring himself to eat. He closed the door of the back room very gently. He crossed the common room. He unbarred the front door of the tavern, and he opened it a crack, and he looked out into the morning. The high street was a slow brown river of mud, but the rain had stopped. The sky was the colour of pewter. Across the way, at the bakery, Hetta Brindle was sweeping the step. She looked up as the door opened, and she lifted a hand in greeting, and Brennan lifted his hand back and his face. He hoped. Looked like the face of a tavernkeeper who had slept the storm out behind a barred door, and not the face of a man whose entire life had ended and begun again in the space of a single night. "Morning, Brennan!" Hetta called. "Morning, Hetta!" "You'll be opening up at noon, I take it?" "As always." She nodded and went back to her sweeping. Brennan closed the door. He leaned his forehead against the wood for a long moment, and he breathed in, and he breathed out, and he thought. He had until noon. He had until noon to decide what he was going to do. There were 3 things he could do, and he turned them over in his mind one by one as he moved through the empty common room, writing chairs, wiping down the bar, performing the small ordinary motions of his small ordinary life. The first thing he could do was send Vraska away. As soon as she was strong enough to walk, and she would not be strong enough today, he knew that she had lost too much blood and gone too long without sleep. He could give her food and coin and a cloak, and he could send her north into the hills, where the orc roads ran wild and where no man of Hollowbrook would ever follow. He could keep his head down. He could keep his name. He could go on washing tankards in the Crooked Hart until his hair was all the way grey and his hands were too stiff to hold a rag. He could pretend that none of this had happened. The second thing he could do was kill her. He hated himself for thinking it. He hated himself with a clean, cold, surgical hatred that he had not felt in many years. But he made himself think it through to the end, because that is what his father had taught him to do. Think every thought all the way through, Aldrin, even the foul ones, because a thought you have not finished thinking is a thought that can still surprise you. He could kill her. He could kill the child. He could bury them both in the back garden, beneath the apple tree, where the soil was soft from the rain and where no one would think to dig for 100 years. He could go on with his life, and no one would ever know that an orc had been in the tavern, and no one would ever know that the last of House Aldermere had ended on a cot in a back room in a village no one had ever heard of. He could. He would not. He understood, standing there with his forehead against the wood of the front door, that he would die before he did such a thing. He understood it the way a man understands that he is breathing, or that his name is his name, or that the sun will rise. He understood it in a place beneath thought, beneath choice, beneath any of the small considered things he had built his life out of in the long years of running. And he understood, too. And this was the harder thing, that he had understood it from the moment he had opened the door the night before, that the choice had been made then. That everything since had been only the slow working out of a decision that had been made the instant he had said, "Come in." So that left the third thing. The third thing was to fight. He stood up straight. He turned away from the door. He walked behind the bar, and he reached down, and from the lowest shelf, behind the kegs, behind the dust, behind the empty bottles he had kept for no reason, he drew out a long oiled bundle of dark cloth that he had not touched in 11 years. He laid the bundle on the bar. He unrolled it. Inside was a sword. It was not a tavernkeeper's sword. It was not a hunter's blade or a townsman's hanger. It was a long-bladed cavalry sword, double-edged, with a basket hilt of dark steel and a pommel shaped like a stag's head, antlered in profile, with a single small star above the brow. It was the sword of a third son of House Aldermere. It was the sword his father had pressed into his hand on the night the keep had burned. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed his hand around the hilt, and he drew it from its scabbard, and the morning light through the tavern window slid down the bright length of the blade like water. Vraska was awake when he came back to the small room. She had propped herself up on the cot, the child asleep at her breast, and she looked at the sword in his hand. At the sword, and at the way he was carrying it, which was the way a man carries a sword when he has been taught to carry one from the time he was old enough to walk. And she nodded, slowly, as though something she had hoped for had just been confirmed. "You are him, then," she said. "Truly. Not only the blood, the training, too. Yes, good." He set the sword down against the wall, within easy reach of the cot. He drew up the small stool and he sat. He looked at her and at the child, and he did not know where to begin. "Tell me about the father," he said at last. "The child's father? Your mate? Tell me his name." She looked at him. The morning light through the shutter slats was beginning to find her face, to pick out the strong shape of her jaw and the long curve of her brow. He could see, now, what he had not been able to see in the firelight. That her face, beneath the Orcish features that had been the only thing he could see the night before, was not the face of a stranger. There was something in the line of her cheekbone, something in the set of her mouth, something familiar and old, and not entirely Orcish at all. "His name was Corv," she said. "Corv of the Broken Tusk, grandson of Dorvath, who had ridden with your father's brother." "My father's brother, yes." Brennan went very still. "My father had no brother," he said. "My father had a sister. She married south. She died in childbirth before I was born. My father had no brother." Vraska looked at him for a long moment. "Your father had a brother," she said. "He was the eldest son. He was named Garrick, the same name your eldest brother bore in his memory. He was disinherited at the age of 18 for taking a wife your grandfather would not accept. He rode south. He rode to the wars. He served, for a time, as a captain of mercenaries on the borders of the Iron Mountains. He took with him a band of 20 men, and he took, too, an Orcish warrior who had saved his life in his first campaign, and that warrior was Dorvath." Brennan opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "My grandfather had no son named Garrick." "Your grandfather had 3 sons, Vraska said, gently, the way one speaks to a person who has just been told that the road they are standing on is not the road they thought. "The eldest he cast out. The middle son inherited and became your father. The youngest died of a fever at the age of 9. The story of the eldest was struck from the family records. It was not spoken of, but it was true. Tavernkeeper. It is the story Dorvath told to my grandmother, and that my grandmother told to my mother, and that my mother told to me on the night before she died of the brand sickness in the camp where they killed my mate." Brennan put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a long time. The child made a small, soft sound against her mother's chest and was still again. "There is more," Vraska said, "if you can bear it." He lifted his head. He nodded. "The eldest son, your father's brother, did not die in the wars. He lived. He had a son of his own by an Orcish woman of Dorvath's clan, and that son was Corv's father, and Corv was my mate. The blood of your house has not been carried in my family only in stories, Tavernkeeper. It has been carried in our veins. The child you are looking at is your blood twice over, once from your father's line, and once from your father's brother's line. She is the daughter of the 2 halves of a family that was sundered 70 years ago, brought together in one small body on the night of a great storm in a village none of us were supposed to find." Brennan looked at the child. He looked at her small, dark face, and at the small, dark hand that had emerged from the swaddling and that was curled, in sleep, against her mother's breastbone. He looked at the small silver mark on her shoulder, the mark that was the mark of his house and of no other house in the world. He looked at her and he thought, cousin, niece, daughter, almost. Whatever the word is, she is mine. Whatever the word is, I am hers. What was her name to be? He asked. Did you and Corv? Did you choose a name? We chose a name, she said. But that was before. The name was for a child born among my people. The child she is now. The child she will have to be, if she is to live, needs a name from yours, from mine. Yes. He thought for a long moment. He thought of his mother, who had died in the burning of the keep. He thought of his sister, Mira, whose last word had been cut in half. "Mirenna," he said, "if you will have it, after my sister and after my mother, whose name was Renna, Mirenna Aldermere of the Broken Tusk, the first of her line, the last of 2 houses, and the first of 1. Vraska closed her eyes. A tear ran down the long ridge of her cheekbone. "Mirenna," she said. "Yes, that is her name." They came at the 2nd hour past noon. He had hoped, foolishly, that he might have a day, perhaps 2. He had hoped that he might bar the tavern and let it be known he was ill, and that he might use the time to think and to plan and to ready himself for the road. But Hollowbrook was a small village, and a small village has many eyes, and one of those eyes, a boy, perhaps, fetching water from the brook at dawn, or a woman taking in her wash from the line, had seen something the night before, a figure at the door, a shadow too large to be a man's. Something. He heard the talking first. It began as a low murmur somewhere up the high street, the sound of voices in a clump rather than scattered, and it grew, the way these things grow, the way a kettle grows from a hiss to a boil if you do not take it off the flame. He was behind the bar, drying glasses, when he heard it. He had set the sword behind him, propped against the back of the bar, where he could reach it without seeming to reach. He looked up. Out the front window, he could see them coming. There were perhaps 15 of them. Halen, the blacksmith, with his great hammer over his shoulder. Old Marek, with the dented helm in his hand as though it were a banner. Father Alwyn, in his black cassock, with a long iron-shod staff. The miller and the miller's 2 sons. 3 men from the farms on the eastern road, men he did not know well. And, behind them, more. Wives, neighbours, a few of the older boys, all of them moving in the slow, purposeful drift of people who have decided, together, that something must be done about something. Brennan put down the glass. He came around the bar. He did not pick up the sword. Not yet. He opened the front door before they could pound on it. He stepped out onto the wooden landing. He folded his arms across his chest and he looked down at them, and they came to a stop in the muddy street below him, and for a long moment no one spoke. "Brennan," said Halen at last. His voice was careful. It was not, yet, the voice of an enemy. "There is a story going around. We need to hear from you whether it is true. What story is that? That you took something in last night, in the storm?" "I took in many things last night, Halen. I took in firewood. I took in the cat. I took in 3 buckets of rainwater that the roof above the kitchen could no longer hold." A small laugh from someone in the back. Father Alwyn did not laugh. "Tavernkeeper," the priest said. His voice was very quiet and very cold. "Did you, or did you not, give shelter to an orc?" Brennan looked at him for a long moment. He could lie. He could lie well. He had been lying for 11 years, and he had become very good at it. He could send them home. He could buy himself 1 more day. But the child was inside. The child with the silver stag on her shoulder. The child whose existence was the answer to a question Brennan had not known until last night that he had been asking his entire life. And he understood, looking down at the men in the muddy street, that there was no version of this day in which he lied and still woke up the man he wished to be. "I did," he said. The silence that came down on the high street was the kind of silence that comes down on a field of battle in the half-second before the arrows fly. Brennan saw Halen's hand tighten on the haft of his hammer. He saw old Marek's mouth begin to open in a roar. "She came to my door in labour," Brennan said, before the roar could come. His voice was loud now, louder than he had spoken in 11 years in Hollowbrook, the voice of the boy who had been raised to address his father's bannerman from a high stone wall. She had walked 5 days through the high pass. She had no weapon. She was alone. She asked for nothing but a fire to lie down beside, and I gave her one. "You!" Marek choked. "And the child," Brennan went on, and his voice did not shake, "was born just before the dawn. A daughter. And she is in my back room now, in her mother's arms, and she is not going anywhere, and neither is her mother until they are well enough to travel. And then they will travel, and they will travel with me." Father Alwyn's staff struck the mud. "You have lost your reason, tavernkeeper." "No, Father, I have just found it. There is a price for harboring the unmade. There is a price for breaking the law of the village. There is no law of the village," Brennan said, "that I am bound to. I am not Brennan Marsh of Hollowbrook. I have never been Brennan Marsh of Hollowbrook. I am Aldrin Cassius Aldermere, third and last son of Lord Cassian of Northwatch, and I have lived under your roofs and drunk at your fires for 11 years on the kindness of a name that was not mine to give, and I have loved you for it. And I tell you now, before the gods and before this child and before whatever is left of my house, I will not let you take what is in that back room." He drew the sword. He had not meant to. He had meant to wait. But his hand had been moving toward it for the last 3 sentences, and he found himself with it in his grip, the long, bright blade naked in the noon light, the stag-headed pommel turned out toward the men of Hollowbrook so that they could see, every one of them, the antlers and the star. Halen the blacksmith took a step back. Old Marek lowered his helm. Father Alwyn looked at the pommel. He looked at Brennan's face. He looked at the pommel again. And the silence on the high street grew very, very deep. It was Halen who spoke first. He had set down his hammer. He had not let go of it, but he had lowered it from his shoulder, and the head of it rested now in the mud by his boot. He was looking at Brennan, at the sword, at the pommel, at the face that he had served drinks to and broken bread with for 11 years. And he was looking at him as a man looks at something he is seeing for the first time. "Aldermere," he said. The word was strange in his mouth. The northern house. They were burned out, Brennan said, 23 years ago. The keep at Northwatch was put to the torch. My father was killed in the Great Hall. My mother and my brothers and my sister died in the same hour. I was 12. I ran. I have been running ever since. And the woman in your back room is the great-granddaughter of the Orcish captain who rode with my father's brother in the Southern Wars. The blood of my house was carried into her line 3 generations ago. The child she has just born is the last of House Aldermere. I have proof of it. I have her token, and I have my own, and they are the same, and I have the child's mark to bear witness besides. He held up the leather cord around his neck. He held up the small silver stag. He turned it so that they could see it, and so that they could see, on the pommel of the sword in his other hand, that the 2 stags were the same stag, made by the same hand, in the same forge, perhaps in the same hour. Father Alwyn had gone very pale. "You ask us," he said, "to believe. I ask you to believe nothing, Father. I tell you what is true. You may do with the truth what you will. But if any man in this village raises a hand against the woman in my back room or the child in her arms, he will answer to me with this blade in my hand, and he will answer to the gods of my house with his soul. And I tell you, Father, Halen, all of you, I tell you that I have not held this sword in 11 years, and there is not a man among you, nor all of you together, who can stand against it." It was not a boast. He spoke it the way a man speaks the time of day. And the men of Hollowbrook, who were not warriors but who were not fools, heard it the way it was meant. There was a long silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, came a voice he had not expected. "My grandson," said old Marek. The old man pushed forward. He was small and bent, and his hand shook on the dented helm. He came to the foot of the wooden landing, and he looked up at Brennan with eyes that were rheumy and bright at once. "My grandson died at Carrowmore," he said, with an Orcish arrow in his back. "He was 19. I have hated the Orc kin every day of my life since. Every day, tavernkeeper." every single day. Brennan did not lower the sword, but he did lower his eyes, just a little, to meet the old man's gaze. "I am sorry, Marek. My grandson," Marek went on, his voice trembling, "was killed by orcs who rode under the banner of a war chief named Throck of the Black Reach. Throck, who was paid in southern coin by men who had no quarrel with him and no love for him, and who wanted my grandson and his fellows dead for reasons that had nothing to do with orc or man. I learned this. I learned it 10 years after the fact, from a soldier who had been there and who had seen the coin change hands. I learned that my grandson was killed by men in distant rooms who used orcs as their knives, and that the orcs themselves were used and then thrown away, and that I had spent 10 years hating the wrong thing." He looked at the sword. He looked at the silver token on its cord. "Aldermere," he said, "I knew your father's name when I was a young man. He was a good lord. He was killed by the same hands that killed my grandson, only it took them longer to find his throat. I am too old to fight anyone, tavernkeeper, but I am not too old to stand on a step. If anyone wants to go through that door, they will go through me first." He turned. He set his back to the door. He held the dented helm against his chest. And it was Halen, then, who let the hammer fall fully into the mud. "My brother died at Carrowmore too," he said. He did not look at Brennan. He looked at the helm in Marek's hands. "I had not heard the story of the coin. It was not a story they wanted told," Marek said. Halen breathed out, slowly, through his nose. "I will not be the third man on that step," he said, "but I will not be the first to climb it, either." He picked his hammer back out of the mud. He shouldered it. He turned and he walked away up the high street toward the smithy. One by one, the others followed. Father Olwen was the last. He stood for a long time in the mud, looking up at Brennan, and his face was a face that had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. At last he too turned, without a word, and he walked back toward the chapel, and the door of the chapel closed behind him, and the high street was empty. Old Marek was still standing on the step. "You can put the sword down now, lordling," he said quietly. Brennan looked down at the old man. He put the sword down. They left Hollowbrook on a morning 2 weeks later. Vraska was strong enough by then, just barely. The child Mirena had begun to open her eyes to the world and to look at it with what could only be called interest, and her birthmark, the silver stag on her shoulder, had not faded the way Brennan had half feared, half hoped it might. It had darkened, if anything. It had sharpened. It was the mark of who she was, and she was going to wear it her whole life, and Brennan understood that he would spend his whole life teaching her what it meant. He sold the tavern. He sold it to Halen's cousin, a woman named Joss, who had been wanting a business of her own for many years, and who had the coin and the temperament for it. He gave her a fair price. He gave her the kegs and the kitchen and the cat. He kept the sword and the cord with the 2 silver tokens and a small chest of personal things he had not unpacked in 11 years. Old Marek came to see them off. He came at dawn, in his good coat, with the dented helm in his hand. He walked up to the wagon where Vraska sat with the child wrapped against her chest, and he looked up at her. At the great grey-green woman who had been, 2 weeks before, the thing he had hated most in the world. And he said, in a voice that was steady and clear, "My grandson's name was Thomas Marek. He liked apples. He was afraid of horses, but rode them anyway. He laughed too loud at his own jokes. He would have liked the look of your daughter, I think. I want you to know his name, Mistress, because I think it is a good thing for the dead to be known by the living, even when the living are strangers, and even when they are far away." Vraska looked down at him for a long moment. Then she bowed her head, slowly, in the Orcish way, chin to chest, eyes closed, and she said, in her low, careful voice, "Thomas Marek. I will say his name to my daughter when she is old enough. I will tell her that an old man named her grandfather to me on the morning we rode north. I will tell her that the world is kinder than it seems, sometimes in the smallest of places." The old man's eyes filled. He nodded. He stepped back. Halen was there too, at a distance, leaning against the wall of the smithy with his great arms folded. He did not come closer. But when Brennan caught his eye, the blacksmith lifted his hand. Not a wave exactly, but an acknowledgement, the kind of gesture a man makes when he is saying, "Go safely," without saying it aloud. Father Olwen was not there. The wagon rolled out of Hollowbrook at the second hour after dawn. They took the north road. They took it slowly, because Vraska was still not at her full strength, and because the child needed to be nursed often, and because there was no hurry. Brennan had waited 23 years. He could wait a few weeks more. They rode for a long time in silence that first morning. The road climbed out of the valley of Hollowbrook and up into the foothills of the Iron Mountains, and the air grew cold and clean, and somewhere around the middle of the afternoon Vraska, who had been watching the road behind them, turned and looked at Brennan and said, "You have not told me what we are going to do." He glanced at her. "You have not asked. I am asking now." He thought for a while. The horse plodded on. The child slept. "There is a man in the city of Vellenmark," he said, "who served as my father's master-at-arms. He is old now, but he is still alive. I have known where he was for many years. I never went to him, because to go to him was to begin a thing I was not ready to begin. I think I am ready now. He will help you. He will help me. He will know who else is still alive. There are others, scattered, who served my father, who would come to the standard of his line if a standard were raised. It will not be many. It will not be enough to take Northwatch back by force, but it will be enough to begin. Begin what?" He looked down at the child in her arms. "A claim," he said, "a petition, a long, slow work of law and witness and patient pressure brought before the courts of the southern kings, who owe the House of Aldermere a debt they have never paid. I do not know if I will see Northwatch again in my lifetime, Vraska. I do not know if Morenna will see it in hers. But I know that if I do nothing, the house dies with me, and the child on your chest is just a strange-blooded girl with an odd mark on her shoulder instead of what she is. And what is she? She is the heir. She is the proof. She is the answer to a wrong that was done before she was born, and she is the only living thing in the world who can make that wrong into a question that the courts will have to answer." Vraska looked at him for a long time. Then she shifted the child against her chest, and she looked out at the road ahead, and she said, "Then we go to Vellenmark." "Yes! And after Vellenmark? After Vellenmark, we go where we have to go, and we keep her safe, and we wait." She nodded. The road climbed. The sun went west. By evening they had come to a small inn at the foot of the first pass, where a one-eyed woman who asked no questions gave them a room above the stables, and where the child slept her first night outside the village of her birth, and where Brennan Marsh, who was Brennan Marsh no longer, lay awake for a long time listening to her breathing, and to her mother's breathing, and to the slow, steady beat of his own heart, which had been, for the first time in 23 years, the heart of a man with somewhere to go. It is many years on now. Morenna is 16. She is tall, taller than her father was at her age, though not yet as tall as her mother, and perhaps she will never be. Her skin is the colour of riverstone in spring, halfway between her mother's deep, mossy grey-green and her father's wheat pale, and her eyes are the colour of amber that has been held too long against a flame. She wears her hair in 2 long braids, in the Orcish way, but she carries her shoulders square in the way she was taught at her father's knee. She speaks 3 languages. She rides a horse well. She is not yet permitted to draw the long cavalry sword that hangs above the hearth, but she has been practicing with a wooden one since she was 9, and her father, who watches her practice from the kitchen doorway with his arms folded across his chest, has begun to think that perhaps next year he will let her try the steel. They did not take back Northwatch. That is the truth of the long story. The petition to the Southern Kings dragged on for 11 years and ended, in the end, in a partial settlement. A sum of coin, a writ of recognition, the formal acknowledgement that the House of Aldermere had been wronged and that its line had not, as the official histories had claimed, ended in fire. It was not enough to retake the keep. It was not enough to raise the banner over the Great Hall again. But it was enough. It was enough, with the coin, to buy a small piece of land in a green valley 3 days' ride south of where Northwatch had stood. It was enough to build a long, low house there, of grey stone and dark timber. It was enough to set a forge beside it, and a stable, and a small chapel that was open to whatever gods anyone cared to bring through the door. And it was enough. This was the part that Vraska had insisted upon, and that Brennan, in the end, had agreed to build at one end of the property a tavern. The tavern was called the Two Stags. It bore, above its great oak door, 2 carved crests. One was the stag of House Aldermere, antlered in profile, with the single star above the brow. The other was the broken tusk of Vraska's clan, set within a wreath of mountain ash. The 2 crests faced each other across the lintel, and beneath them, in letters carved deep into the wood, was a single line in the old tongue: "All who come in peace, come in." 1. The tavern was busy, most nights. It was a strange place, the Two Stags. It sat on a stretch of road that had been, for many years, a hard road. A road where caravans travelling between the Iron Mountains and the southern cities had to choose between a long detour and a short pass that was rumoured to be haunted by bandits and worse. The Two Stags had changed that road. Travellers stopped there. Word spread. Slowly, slowly. In the way these things spread, it had become known that the keepers of the Two Stags would take in anyone. Man, orc, half-elf, dwarf, the rare and skittish woodfolk of the deep north, and that no one had ever been turned away, and that no one had ever been hurt within its walls. It had also become known, more quietly, that the master of the Two Stags had been, in another life, a lord. That he carried a sword above his hearth that bore the crest of a house thought ended. That he had taken to wife, though no priest had said the words over them, for no priest of any faith they knew would yet say such words. An Orcish woman of the high country, and that they were raising, between them, a daughter whose shoulder bore a mark that was both her father's name and her mother's blood. People came to see her sometimes. Scholars, old veterans, children of houses that had been allied with Aldermere in the old days, who came in plain clothes and asked, quietly, after dinner, to see the crest on her shoulder, and who left the next morning with their eyes thoughtful and their purses lighter. Brennan was, by now, a man past 50. His hair was all the way grey, and the scar on his thumb had faded to a line of silver, and he no longer woke in the night sweating from dreams of the keep on fire. He worked the bar most evenings. He kept the books. He had taught Mirena her letters and her numbers and the long lineage of her father's house, and he had let her mother teach her the long lineage of her mother's clan, and he had said to her on the night of her 13th birthday, when she had asked him, with that solemn directness that had always been her way, whether she was meant to be an orc or a woman or a lord or a tavernkeeper or what, he had said to her, "You are meant to be Mirena. Everything else is what you choose." She had thought about that for a long time. She thought about it still. On the night this story ends, on a clear summer evening, with the long light coming in through the open door of the Two Stags, and the smell of wood smoke and roast lamb on the air, Mirena was working the common room. She carried trays. She filled cups. She paused, sometimes, to listen to a song from one of the travellers, or to answer a question, or to laugh at one of her mother's jokes, which were always quiet and always brutal and always landed exactly where they were aimed. A traveller came in through the door. He was a young man, road-worn, with a soaked cloak and tired eyes. He stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the 2 carved crests above the lintel, and then he looked into the warm, bright room. at the long tables, at the great Orcish woman behind the bar, at the grey-haired man drawing ale, at the tall braided girl with the amber eyes who was carrying a tray of bread toward the corner. And he said, in a voice that was hesitant and hopeful at once, Is this the place? The place where they let anyone in?" Mirena set down her tray. She turned. She looked at the young man in the doorway. She looked at her father behind the bar, and her father looked back at her, and he gave her the smallest of nods. She walked across the common room. She held out her hand to the stranger in the doorway, and her sleeve fell back from her wrist, and the firelight caught for a moment on the small silver stag at her shoulder. "Yes," she said. Come in, before the whole valley hears the door." And he came in, and the door of the two stags closed gently behind him. And somewhere out in the long blue evening, a wind moved through the leaves of the mountain ash, and an old man in a village called Hollowbrook, who had once stood on a step with a dented helm against his chest, dreamed, in his last sleep, of apples and of his grandson's laughter. And the world, which is always ending, began in one small place again. The end.